Everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are. Bonjour tout le monde. My name is Don Davies. I'm the Member of Parliament for Vancouver Kingsway and the New Democrat critic for health. I'm extremely pleased to be joined today by my colleagues Marcus Pulowski, who sits on the Standing Committee on Health and represents Thunder Bay Rainy River, Luc Thériault, who is the critic for health for the Bloc Québécois and represents the good people of Montcalm, and Elizabeth May, who represents Sandwich Gulf Islands and is the parliamentary leader of the Green Party of Canada. Now, those of you who have spent time on the Hill may appreciate the unusual nature of this news conference. It is relatively rare to see MPs from all parties, virtually all parties, coming together in common cause in pan-partisan agreement. And I think that reflects the extraordinary times that we find ourselves in, and it also reflects the extraordinary cooperation that I think is required and recognized by people all over the world. I'm going to pause and say that, as my remarks will show, the Conservative Party is also in agreement with the thrust of what we will say today, and we're invited to this conference, but I think for logistics reasons, we're unable to send someone. We're here today to join voices in common cause to call on the Canadian government to immediately support the call of dozens of countries around the world upon the World Trade Organization to waive trade rules on intellectual property that are working to prevent countries from producing COVID vaccines who have the ability to do so. This morning's news conference follows a letter that myself and a number of my colleagues here today and in other parties have drafted collectively that has now been signed by over 70 members of Parliament, remarkably from every party represented in Parliament. We know this. We know that the SARS-CoV-2 virus knows no borders. It can spread easily, and it is a global problem. We know that it mutates, and that the longer we take to vaccinate everyone on Earth, the more vulnerable everyone is to new variants. As has been said repeatedly, no one is safe until everyone is safe. I listened to Peter Singer, who's an advisor to the World Health Organization yesterday, describe the situation in, I think, a very powerful way. He said it's like there's a million bonfires all over the globe, and the embers of those fires are spreading everywhere. There is a profound issue of equity. We believe that all humans have a right to be protected, whether they live in poor, developing, or developed countries alike. We know that the TRIPS rules, that's the trade-related intellectual property rules, that we are asking to be temporarily waived to allow countries to manufacture vaccines, have been developed for normative times and to protect the legitimate intellectual property rights. That is not the case today with the COVID vaccines. We are not talking about running shoes or farm equipment. We are talking about a global health crisis, a planetary pandemic that puts all of us at risk. Most of the investment that went into the research and development of COVID vaccines was publicly funded. The normal case for an individual patent holder seeking protection because they risked their own capital and resources does not apply in these circumstances. Finally, we believe it is in our world's interest to vaccinate as many people as fast as possible. So any barrier anywhere, such as the TRIPS rules, that works against this must be removed. Prime Minister Trudeau has, we think, correctly stated from the beginning of this pandemic that we need a Team Canada approach. This is true, but it is not enough. We also believe we need a Team World approach. So today, parliamentarians are putting down our partisan shields. We are coming together to join common cause to call on this government to immediately follow the lead of US President Joe Biden. We cannot put the profits of a handful of pharmaceutical companies over the public health interests of the global population. Every day that we wait, humans get infected. Every day we wait, humans die. And so we're calling on the Canadian government to immediately add its voice to all of those calling for a removal of the TRIPS barriers temporarily to allow every country anywhere who has the ability to produce COVID vaccines to protect global health. Thank you. I will now turn the microphone over to my great colleague, Marcus Pawlowski.
Thank you very much, Don. Je vais parler en anglais, mais avant ça, je veux dire remercier pour tous nos collègues de Québec qui ont signé cette lettre-là. Alors, thank you very much, Don, for doing this. As a doctor who's worked a lot of years in developing countries for poor people, I certainly appreciate the importance of this and also the political significance of the fact that we have people from all parties joined together to do this. I also want to thank someone who's not here, and that's Nathaniel Erskine Smith. I feel a little bit guilty about that because Nate has contributed at least as much to this as I have. We all agreed, though, that we would only have one person per party, and Nate graciously suggested that it be me. Thanks to you, Nate, for that. Too bad for the press, because I think Nate's a better speaker than I am. Now, we actually started this letter and distributing this letter before the Biden announcement, the great Biden announcement, and we were caught a little surprised by the fact that the Americans beat us to it. Now, like most Canadians, I don't really like it when the Americans beat us at anything, but I think in this instance, I'm actually pretty happy that they beat us to it. I'd like to thank the MPs from all parties who've signed this letter. I think there were others who may have liked to have signed, but for one reason or another didn't. I think it's still open to signatories. I think it's really great to see so many MPs willing to put their compassion for others above partisan politics. And I think that's really what's happened with this letter. The pandemic ought to be something that brings humanity collectively together. It doesn't matter whether you're a poor person living in the slums of Mumbai or Soweto or Mexico City, or you're a rich business executive working on Wall Street or Bay Street. The pandemic basically put us all in the same shoes. We were all faced with the same kind of problems, the same worries, worried about our jobs, having to live apart from our families and friends, worried about our health or the health of people in our families. Now, has the pandemic actually brought the world closer together? So far, it doesn't seem like it. Unlike World War II, where the shared suffering led to the UN Charter and the international global legal order, what in terms of improved international cooperation has come out of COVID? So far, it doesn't seem very much. In fact, it seems actually the opposite. The world has kind of been pushed apart by COVID. Borders have been closed. We've seen vaccine nationalism. We've seen global supply chains becoming domestic. And I think it's basically been a matter of every country for itself in fighting the pandemic. And of course, also in Parliament, we've seen the same fighting as always. Partly that's natural, and it's partly because it's the job of the opposition to criticize our government. We pay them the big bucks to criticize our government, but maybe also it's because to some extent they don't actually like our government either. But with this letter, I think we see MPs from all parties rising above that, working together. And I don't think it's just us. There are over 100 different countries which support the waiver. The Biden administration supports the waiver. In a recent similar letter, almost 400 EU parliamentarians signed a letter. And I just looked online, there was something about a similar letter signed by 100 members of parliament in England asking for the same thing. I absolutely believe in the value of patent protection. It's a good thing. It helps in general our society. And I think we also have to collectively give a big debt of gratitude to the vaccine producers who really were some of the heroes in this pandemic. Now, they're going to make their money one way or the other. But I think that the waiver is absolutely the right thing to do, because absolutely nothing should stand in our collective goal of humanity, which is ending this pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus. Monsieur Thériault, allez ici, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Don. Alors, d'entrée de jeu, je voudrais dire que tout le caucus du Bloc est unanime derrière la démarche de ce matin et la lettre. Vous savez, une épidémie, on peut y faire face localement ou nationalement, mais la COVID-19, c'est pas une épidémie, c'est une pandémie. Alors, soit on s'y attaque de façon planétaire, soit on n'en viendra jamais à bout. À titre d'exemple, si on pense à nos frères et sœurs haïtiens, au moment où on se parle, Haïti n'a reçu aucune dose pour protéger sa population. Aucune. On ne peut pas s'empêcher de craindre qu'émerge un variant haïtien. Des exemples là, comme ça, là, ça se compte par dizaines. On voit ce qui se passe en Inde, on voit ce qui se passe au Brésil, où une forte concentration de gens infectés et non vaccinés a entraîné une mutation du virus et un nouveau variant. S'il faut que nos vaccins soient impuissants contre un éventuel nouveau variant, ben on va revenir à la case départ. Alors, l'appel qu'on lance aujourd'hui, c'est plus qu'un appel à la solidarité, c'est une mesure de santé publique pour protéger nos populations. Au moment où on se parle, l'initiative COVAX a distribué 53 millions de doses dans 121 pays. C'est mieux que rien, mais c'est très peu quand on sait qu'il y a 8 milliards d'humains sur Terre. Actuellement, là, tous les pays du monde sont en concurrence pour obtenir les vaccins qui sortent d'un nombre trop limité d'usines. Les pays qui ont le moyen de se payer le vaccin se servent en premier et les autres sont derrière la file, avec le risque d'un nouveau variant qui s'y développe. Alors, il y a des usines de fabrication de vaccins qui auraient la capacité de produire, mais qui ne peuvent pas le faire parce qu'elles ne détiennent pas les brevets ou les licences. En Inde, en Afrique du Sud, au Brésil, par exemple. Alors, l'accord sur les droits de propriété intellectuelle qui touche au commerce, conclu là, à l'OMC, a justement été conçu pour une telle situation. Conclu, rappelons-nous que lors de la crise du sida, là, qui faisait rage dans le continent africain, cet accord permet de lever temporairement la protection des vaccins, des brevets pour permettre aux pays en développement de faire face à une crise de santé publique. Cet accord contient des mécanismes de contrôle pour éviter que ces médicaments ne reviennent pour être vendus dans les pays riches. Ça vient protéger l'essentiel du marché des entreprises pharmaceutiques. Alors, quand les pharmaceutiques font valoir leurs droits exclusifs pour s'opposer à cette levée partielle des brevets, ben, elles oublient que les gouvernements ont investi des milliards pour les aider à développer les vaccins. Et même si plusieurs détenteurs de brevets sont des entreprises américaines, le gouvernement Biden appuie leur levée. Et hier, l'Assemblée nationale du Québec a été unanime pour adopter une motion présentée par des députés de tous les partis. Et je cite, que l'Assemblée nationale salue et appuie la décision du président des États-Unis d'appuyer la résolution présentée à l'Organisation mondiale du commerce visant à suspendre les brevets des vaccins contre la COVID-19. Fin de la citation. Alors aujourd'hui, nous demandons simplement au gouvernement du Canada d'en faire autant. Merci.
Merci, Luc. And finally, but not least, Ms. May, the floor is yours.
Merci, Don, et merci à tous mes collègues. Merci à Luc pour votre caucus. Je suis tellement heureux de reconnaître que votre caucus, comme nous, comme Verts, nous sommes unanimes dans cette position que c'est absolument essentiel pour l'humanité, pour la santé de l'humanité, d'avoir un changement dans le règlement de l'Organisation mondiale du commerce. As Greens, we are also united and so grateful for the non-partisan spirit that so many members of Parliament have signed this letter. I go back to the origins of the TRIPS agreement. It was part of the Uruguay round. I've often commented that if we cared as a community of nations as much about climate as we care about protecting intellectual property, we would have treaties that actually worked. TRIPS agreement is very forceful, and an exemption in this case is well required for the health of all. It's a matter, as Donna said, it's fairness. It's also so very within reach that we have, having had billions and billions of dollars of public funds go to the innovators and the pharmaceutical companies. And yes, thank you to the creative scientific minds that developed the vaccines. But it's not possible to believe that we would fail to temporarily suspend TRIPS rules so that countries around the world can manufacture the vaccines themselves. It's astonishing to me that the President of the United States, usually a government that is a champion of the hegemony of things like TRIPS rules, would be ahead of us. We note, and I note, that when asking Minister of Health Patty Hajdu about this the other night in our emergency debate on the COVID crisis in Alberta, that was when I realized, of course, it's not Patty Hajdu that decides, it's Mary Ng, it's the Trade Department people, and we're dragging our feet. And so doing this together, as we're doing it, I hope that within hours, the Canadian government will agree that it's time to suspend TRIPS rules temporarily in light of this pandemic crisis. Merci.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Now we'll turn it over to any media for questions.
If you have a question, please indicate by using the raised hand function. Si vous avez une question, veuillez l'indiquer en utilisant la fonction main levée. We now go to Boris Prou. Nous allons maintenant à Boris Prou.
Merci. Ma question est très simple. On a compris que, à part adopter une motion à la Chambre des communes, ce qui n'a pas fonctionné hier, quelle action concrète le gouvernement pourrait prendre et quel genre de leadership vous vous attendez du Canada? J'ai entendu parler de l'OMC. Est-ce que c'est auprès d'institutions internationales qu'on devrait agir dans ce dossier-là?
Who would like to field that? Monsieur Thériault?
La protection des brevets est mondiale, donc c'est à l'OMC que ça va se passer. C'est à l'OMC que le gouvernement et les gouvernements qui se sont prononcés là, dans les derniers jours doivent amener les gens à appliquer cet accord-là qui date, comme je le disais tout à l'heure, du moment où il y a eu l'émergence du sida là, et la grande contamination en Afrique. Alors, ça fait plusieurs années que ça existe. Il y a des dispositions pour le faire. Donc, c'est là que ça va se passer et c'est là qu'il faut le faire. Ça prend un leadership. Déjà, les Américains le font. Les compagnies qui sont concernées actuellement sont des compagnies américaines. Ça n'empêche pas le gouvernement américain d'avoir une conscience planétaire et de dire, regarde, si on veut passer à travers cette pandémie-là, il faut absolument qu'on puisse vacciner tout le monde le plus vite possible. Alors, voilà, c'est là où ça va se passer.
Est-ce que... Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry, please go ahead.
Merci, je voulais juste savoir s'il y a des considérations de protection des droits de propriété. Si vous avez quand même des craintes par rapport à au fait que si on revient sur les grands principes de droit de propriété, ça pourrait nuire en fait à l'innovation ou ce genre de choses. Est-ce que vous pensez que c'est quand même compatible?
Écoutez, on parle ici d'une exception qui est déjà prévue dans cet accord-là. Et il y a des mesures de contrôle, comme j'en ai parlé tout à l'heure. Et donc, à ce moment-là, les pharmaceutiques vont pouvoir garder leur marché, le marché et continuer à faire de l'argent. C'est le cas de le dire. Et donc, dans ce sens-là, il n'y a pas de problème. Actuellement, les pharmaceutiques ne sont pas capables de fournir à la tâche. Et ce n'est pas en 2023 qu'il faut qu'on ait vacciné tout le monde. C'est le plus vite possible. Alors, le danger est grand qu'à un moment donné, on se retrouve avec des situations où toute la démarche de vaccination et tous les argents qu'on a mis actuellement dans cette opération-là soient problématiques parce que justement, il y a des mutations et des mutations et on n'en sortira jamais. D'autre part, il y a aussi que ces plateformes de vaccins-là, ARN messager, sont les plateformes les plus intéressantes pour pouvoir justement s'adapter aux variants. Alors, c'est ce qu'il faut produire le plus vite possible. Alors, il y a des ententes, il y a un accord qui est très clair là-dessus sur comment et les dispositions sont claires et il y a aussi des mesures de contrôle. Mesures de contrôle où il faut identifier les lots, où les lieux sont identifiés, où le destinataire est identifié. Alors, il ne peut pas y avoir là, de problématiques où cette production-là deviendrait une concurrence dans les pays qui sont capables de se payer ces vaccins-là dans les pays riches.
We will now go to Mia Robson from the Canadian Press. Nous allons maintenant passer à Mia Robson de la Presse canadienne.
Hi, yeah, thanks for taking my question. Curious what your thoughts are on the proposals Canada did make, sort of avoiding having to do something about the waiver, but pushing countries and the WTO to find the ability or the sort of manufacturing capacity that did exist to ramp up production, and whether a waiver would actually overcome the barriers to manufacturing that maybe Canada saw itself, the fact that we are not actually producing vaccines here, despite having at least some capacity to do so. Just wondering if any of you could weigh in on that.
Well, maybe I'll start off with that. It's a pretty complex global, I think, environment. There's a lot of pieces to this. What we're doing is we're zeroing in on one particular barrier that we know is a barrier. It's been identified by countries as a barrier. South Africa, Brazil, and India have been asking for months to have the TRIPS rules waived. And as we've heard, I think there's about 100 countries that have signed on. So that one particular barrier is something that we know is preventing certain countries who do have the ability, the technical ability to produce vaccines from doing so. You know, countries like India and Brazil have very, very large pharmaceutical manufacturing capacities. They simply don't have access to the technology or the intellectual property. But were they to get that, then they would be able to be producing tens of millions of doses of vaccines. So the other thing I would say is, I think it's a fair criticism to say that a number of countries, and I'm sorry to include Canada in this, but I must, have been stalling that process. It's not complicated. I know that Canada's position for the last several months has been that we're not for the waiver, we're not opposed to the waiver. We keep asking these countries for more information. To me, that's disingenuous. There is the basis of the request that's being made is clear. The ask is clear. What the consequences would be is clear as well. And so I think that speaking for the New Democrats, we're asking the Canadian government to take a strong step forward to quit delaying and to add their voice along with that of the US President Joe Biden and the rest of the world.
If I could just add, it's been some months that countries like Pakistan, Mozambique, Kenya have been asking for this waiver, and I completely agree with Don. It's shameful It's absolutely shameful that a handful of wealthy countries can get vaccines for themselves and are denying a simple waiver on a temporary basis. And then there are other challenges. Absolutely right, Mia. There's challenges of the capacity for countries to manufacture, but it does remind me, as Luke has reminded us, of the AIDS crisis in Africa, and when pharmaceutical companies, for their own profit motives, withheld life-saving treatments for AIDS in Africa. And it took a lot of work. And I remember large foundations like the Clinton Foundation negotiating with Big Pharma to bring down the price, as much as pharmacare would work that way in Canada, bring down the price through bulk buying. But in a massive global pandemic, I mean, it was shameful enough when it was AIDS in Africa. This is desperate that we move fast. And I'm absolutely amazed. I'm sure many journalists on this call are aware that what the United States has just done is a complete turnaround on usual US policy, and Canada must run to catch up.
Now, let me preface my remarks by saying I speak for myself. I don't speak for the Liberal government. It's a good question, and there are certainly other ways we could address the shortage of vaccines in developing countries. There's certainly voluntary agreements. There's already the opportunity for compulsory licensing, which is allowed under the TRIPS agreement and reaffirmed by the Doha Declaration. These are possibilities, and some have argued that we could use these in order to vaccinate more people quickly. However, why would India, South Africa, Brazil be asking for the waiver if they thought they could do it just as fast by compulsory licensing? And certainly, people have said that's a very cumbersome, slow process. I think we all have to agree, given the severity of the epidemic, that maybe it requires faster solutions, more extreme solutions, and I think politically there's an importance in showing global solidarity, that when people are literally dying en masse in places like India and South America, that we stand for what's right, which is getting the vaccines out there as quick as possible, rather than putting the economic interests of vaccine makers ahead of that. Now, having said that, vaccine manufacturers are going to make a lot of money over the pandemic, and this is a temporary measure, and I don't think any of us is asking for any permanent dropping of patent protection. This is a temporary thing, and if there is a time that we're going to take extraordinary measures, certainly this is the time during a pandemic.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, as a follow-up, if we look at India specifically, the Serum Institute, they have a license to produce AstraZeneca. The limiting factor there isn't that they don't have the formula or the intellectual information. The limiting factor there is the raw materials. So how much of this is also about waiving export controls so that the places that might be able to manufacture these vaccines can actually get the materials they need to do so? Because having the formula isn't going to make vaccines. They actually need the materials as well.
Well, that's true. Well, of course, they have access to the AstraZeneca vaccine because I believe the Oxford AstraZeneca project voluntarily made their intellectual property available to any country that wanted to manufacture. I don't think that's the case with the messenger RNA intellectual property. Perhaps India would be producing the mRNA vaccines were they to be able to get that the IP and technology from Pfizer and Moderna. I think that a waiver of the TRIPS rules may facilitate that. So I think that's part of the answer. Does any of my colleagues want to weigh in?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think certainly the waiver applies, I would have thought, to all intellectual property rights which affect the production of vaccines, which could include the precursors and the raw materials in order to make the vaccine. So And I don't think this has actually been finalized before the WTO, but I would think that the waiver ought to apply to the raw materials and things required in order to make the vaccines. Thanks.
Do we have any additional questions on the line? If you have a question, please indicate by using the raised hand function. Avons-nous des questions supplémentaires sur l'appel? Si vous avez une question, veuillez l'indiquer en utilisant la fonction main levée. Nous allons maintenant à Boris Prou pour une question supplémentaire.
Merci de prendre mon autre question. Je vais la poser dans les deux langues. Quelle est votre prochaine étape, finalement, des différents partis? Est-ce que vous allez tenter de reproposer une motion? Est-ce qu'il y a même un aspect législatif qui pourrait être considéré? So what's the next step for different parties? Is it to ask once again for a motion at the House of Commons, or would you consider a legislative piece for all that? You can all answer.
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Oui, merci, Boris. Je pense que nous sommes proches à une décision favorable de notre gouvernement, j'espère. I found the response I got in Parliament. What night was it now? I guess it was Tuesday night, to our Honorable Minister of Health, Patty Hajdu. Her response suggested that the negotiations were moving along in a good direction. I have a sense that as parliamentarians, raising public awareness now is the most efficient thing to do. And I really do think with the strong, nonpartisan approach of so many members of Parliament that we can be encouraging to Minister Ng. And if there is, I've found historically, there's a strong group of our civil service who have negotiated these agreements, and may perhaps if the decision making was with the Minister of Health instead of with the Minister of Trade, the decision would be made already. I hope it will be made very, very soon, and in the direction of course, granting a temporary suspension of the TRIPS rules in relation to COVID vaccines.
Luc?
Si je peux me permettre, déjà hier avec les motions qui ont été discutées, pas discutées, mais présentées en Chambre, après le gouvernement s'est dit ouvert là, à regarder ça. Je pense que les choses avancent. Je pense aujourd'hui qu'il y avait peut-être une autre tentative. Là, on est ensemble. Je ne sais pas s'il y aurait eu une motion qui serait passée aujourd'hui. Il reste que, je pense que c'était technique, peut-être l'opposition des gens qui ont dit non hier. Je veux dire, c'est pas par la voie législative, là, c'est beaucoup trop long. Il faut agir rapidement. C'est vraiment à l'OMC. Et plus il va y avoir de pays qui vont se prononcer d'ailleurs les pays riches, je pense qu'ils doivent prendre le leadership, et plus les choses vont se faire rondement à l'OMC. Alors, c'est là que ça doit se passer, et ça peut se passer assez rapidement.
I suppose the next step for us here is we want to indicate to the Government of Canada that there is widespread consensus across party lines, across regions, across from the people of Canada, that this is something that they want. I mean, we know that the pharmaceutical companies, they're very effective at expressing their interests, and I'm sure that they are doing so and have done so. We believe that has to be counterbalanced by expressing the interests of people in Canada. And I believe, I think my colleagues would agree that the vast majority of Canadians understand that they want Canada to take a position on the world stage that protects the health of everybody on the planet, and understand the connection between that and our own self-interest. I think it's rare that you have a fusion of collective self-interest with, I think, morality and ethics. And I think that's what this call today expresses. And there's no time to waste. I mean, I hope that we can give Prime Minister Trudeau the confidence that there's no more time to waste. We'd like him to simply state today that Canada supports the waiver. And I must say with Ms. May as well, I hear the ministers of the Crown, they're equivocating a bit, and there seems to be a pause or a caution or reluctance to come out and just say that. I think it's a very important signal to the world. The Prime Minister of Canada comes out clearly and says, we support this. There may be details to work out, but let's at least get our position on the record and move this forward. And maybe that will help jog some of the EU countries that are also not clearly supporting this waiver. So hopefully we can add our voices together for the collective health of everybody.
Alors, si je peux compléter, je dirais que Don a raison. Je pense que déjà, notre démarche transpartisane de ce matin lance un message assez clair au gouvernement. S'il se posait des questions, là, alors là, il est devant une démarche qui, d'un océan à l'autre, rassemble l'ensemble des élus. Alors, c'est beaucoup plus facile de partir de là et de dire, bon, ben, OK, on prend le leadership et on s'en va porter ça à l'OMC. Donc, je pense que c'est pas rien ce qui se passe ce matin et ce qu'on vient de faire et la lettre qu'on adresse au gouvernement. Alors, on espère une réaction rapide et on va attendre la réaction qui devrait venir assez rapidement.
I guess as the Liberal here, I ought to say something. Again, I don't speak for the government, but I think our government and our leadership's heart is in the right place. I think we do want to do the right thing. I think, and I share as much blame as anyone, being a longtime emergency room doctor. When I want to do something, I want to do it now, not days or weeks. And I realize that sometimes in government it takes time, but I do have faith in our government. I do have faith in the leadership that it is genuinely concerned about the global pandemic and doing the right thing in ending the global pandemic.
I guess that might be a good place for us to end. What we all agree on is it's time for action, and we hope that that what we've done today in this initiative across party lines through our letter and through this news conference will help spur that action to occur. So thank you to my colleagues for this. Thank you to the journalists for your attention, and everybody stay well.